Welcome to our newest exhibit, number 4368. Planet, Earth. Species, Human. This holographic reconstruction has been compiled from the archived written works, plays and screenplays, personal letters, and legal documents and court transcripts of the subject, using artificial intelligence. Name, Wilson Mizner, age 56. Date, 1933, night. Location, booth number 50, the Brown Derby Restaurant, Hollywood, California, United States of America. Note that this representation uses the language and style of that Earth era. Viewers may find some of the opinions distasteful, but, we assure you, this is an accurate historical recreation. We do ask that you silence all electronic devices, and refrain from taking flash, or indeed any photographs or videos. Also note that this exhibit is currently in beta, and may be subject to occasional glitches in the program matrix. We are working to resolve these issues and appreciate your comments and feedback to improve this exhibit for all visitors to our intergalactic cultural museum.
If I were ever to tell the story of my life, it would probably be interrupted by the blowing of 1,000,000 police whistles. At various times during my life, I have been a miner, confidence man, medical lecturer, ballad singer, dealer in imitation masterpieces of art, prize fight manager, Florida land promoter, Broadway playwright, and screenwriter in Hollywood. My mother believed it was by the merest accident that I wasn't made president. My father laid out Benicia, the first capital of California. Then, before the incident was entirely closed, Benicia laid out my father. God evidently made Benicia one late Saturday afternoon, and must have had a tea date with a chorus girl and was running late, because it was a mess. I like to dwell on my family ancestry, because there was really nothing wrong with the family up to the point that my mother and father started turning out unmanageable male giants. But I came to the family on May 16th, 1876, and it was of the contention of the masculine brethren of my family that the stork had flown out of a coal hole and left behind it a very distinct aroma of brimstone. The first Mizner we know anything about was a tax collector under Henry VIII, and he evidently got his hands jammed in a cash register because he left very quickly from England for Ireland and came to America in the 1700s. The family were always pioneers, and it makes you think if the police were not always just right behind them, because they were always moving west. My family had an aristocratic maxim that stated, "No gentleman worked in anything but honorable and dignified professions." I abbreviated the family maxim as, "No gentleman works." My mother called me Angel Birdie, but my brothers all kicked me in the shins behind her back, knowing the only thing high and mighty about me was my name. Well, for it I am entirely grateful, because it has prevented me from having any such responsibilities, such as setting a good example. I was 11 years old when I made my first theatrical appearance at Benicia and set up my own billing, so to speak. The staging was at the Mother Goose Lancers of St. Paul's Episcopal Church. A chubby friend of mine, Robert Chisholm, was to play the role of Old King Cole, and I was none too pleased to find out that I had been cast in the role of Simple Simon. But with a slingshot. I hit good old Bob right in the head, and he created such a lump that he couldn't put on old King Cole's crown, and therefore I was made king for either virtue or accuracy, and old Bob had to play the role of Simple Simon because the cornucopia hat could fit over his bulging forehead, which evidently made him look a little too intelligent for the part. Mama Mizner, who was aware of the antecedents, in which I am a bit proud, always used to hope that one day one of her boys would attain the presidency. Eventually, she prayed that most of us would stay out of prison. Incidentally, Mama Mizner, who was the most wonderful, most perfect person who ever lived, prayed in the proper spirit. She prayed to forfend disaster rather than to obtain selfish desires from the deity. This I found to be unusual, for most people would not give God a second thought unless they were asking for something. To be honest, no educational opportunity presented anything better than the concise, witty, and automatically absorbed information to be found at the Mizner Round Table. My mother had a streak of wit like lightning, and the family had a temple of conversation which avoided the tedious. I remember I had a very special gift at being able to make my mother laugh hard. I can remember the look, the beam in her eyes, where tears would come out, tears of laughter. Never was there anyone more perfect or more wonderful in my life anywhere. I learned at a tender age that just as life seems to ascend on a high, something goes wrong and then everything turns around. This slightly pessimistic attitude can probably be traced to the fact that I was kicked out of 3 schools in 4 weeks. And that was before I went to Bates Preparatory in San Rafael. The dean of my dormitory was Father Kelly. If looks could kill, Father Kelly would have been a mass murderer. I was kicked out of Bates after 3 weeks on the charge of knowing nothing and disturbing those who did. But I knew in truth it was because I had inflamed Father Kelly. I had taken a shot put from the gym, put it on a stovetop for about 20 minutes, took it off and rolled it down the hall at Father Kelly's door. He heard it rumble. He answered it, saw it, picked it up, and with a howl he dropped it. After that, Bates gave me their final blessings. Not long after, I found myself sitting on a fire hydrant in Spokane with nothing but 20 cents in my pocket. I knew then that I would have to get my education on the outside, since that's where I always ended up. Then along came Memphis Kennedy. Memphis Kennedy was an out-of-work actor who had been working with the Carney and was looking to skip town. He thought he could get me a job with the show he was leaving. To my surprise, I found out that the prerequisite for the job was to speak Latin. When asked if I could speak it, I said, Latin! I speak it like a native! Memphis smiled and was like, "You're in for a swell job. Couldn't speak it like a native, but I got by for 6 months." Not long after, we were in Dr. Slocum's tent, as Memphis told him about my way of being able to speak Latin, and then it became apparent to why Memphis was leaving the show. Girl trouble. Being in the tent for only 30 minutes, all of a sudden a book came flying from one of the Slocum tents and hit Memphis right in the head. Then a slim blonde in a dressing gown came out and stormed at him, screamed at him, and chased him right out of the tent and into the street, full tilt. Well, that was the last I saw of him. Then Dr. Slocum wanted to demonstration of my superiority of speaking Latin. And he said, "Well, let's see some Latin." And I said, "Si, senor." And then went on to tell the story of a mule driver and its stubborn charge in Spanish. And Dr. Slocum's eyes glazed over and he said, "By God, you really can speak it." I was hired on the spot for $10 a week and a spot to sleep in one of the Slocum tents. I was given a bamboo cane and a pink carnation put on my lapel. I was allowed to talk about anything under the sun, as long as it always came back to Dr. Slocum's suite of vermifuge mastodon medicine. Some of the lines that occur to me are, "Do you suffer a gnawing sensation after abstaining from food for several days? Do you feel tired and weary after a hike of about 30 miles? After a week of sleeplessness, do you suffer from falling eyelids? And when your children cry out in the middle of the night, biting little nails and writhing in pain in their little bodies, well, drive out the parasitic vulpine, that dreaded wolfworm that ties Doloro to the faltering heart with that infallible, heaven-sent Dr. Slocum's sweet vermifuge mastodon medicine." As for the scourge that drove back Memphis Kennedy, her name was Bianca the Beautiful, and she did the fire dance. This dance consisted of her dipping gauze streamers in gasoline, lighting it with a match, and then blazing it about her head and body. Fear of her clothes setting on fire gave her ample reason to toss it off. Her husband, who was always curious to why she was chasing Memphis Kennedy, would accompany her on a folded organ under an iron umbrella. In his spare time, he picked pockets. Dr. Slocum put a hot premium on sales and told me to say that if sales reached a certain point, Bianca will do a very special version of the fire dance. Anything to get the patients to take their medicine. Oh, I was having a grand time, but then someone who knew my uncle saw me at the show and I had to leave it. Uncle Eugene was the governor of the state of Washington. At this time, my brother Edgar was offered a job in the Yukon with the Alaskan Commercial Company. I urged him to take it, and allowed him to convince me to accompany him to God's country. Our timing was pretty good, 1897, the year of one of the greatest gold rushes in history. This was a time to make real money, big money, the only substance that makes the difference of a cruel world nicknaming a person, "Hey you!" I found the place overrun with criminals, common crooks, card sharks, and sporting ladies. I stayed there for 6 years. These born losers were all trying to make their living in the most back-breaking of conditions. I learned in the Klondike that antecedents means very little to a person's character unless their grandmother actually barked. I never really learned the definition of ingratitude until I came to the Klondike. A man I believed in put out the first set of burglar tools ever to turn out in Alaska. I made him the chief of police. I paid his expenses. I ran his campaign. I threw a party the day he took office, and I pinned the gold star on his uniform. And the first man he arrested was me. At the time, there was only one typewriter in town, and someone had stolen it and sold it to a butcher who thought it was a cash register. Well, some of my friends were about to be put away for life. I had no choice. I needed the typewriter to write up the appeal. So, one night, I broke in and I borrowed the typewriter while the butcher was out. And my new chief arrested me. That was the comradeship of the North. Well, not long after, I got a job as a faro dealer in various saloons. I had a partner of mine, Rena. She would show up at my table, pretend not to know me, and then just have an amazing streak of luck. Well, we couldn't run this operation too often, in fear that we would get caught. One day, I dealt Rena so many good hands that she broke the bank. Well, the owner came over and accused her of cheating. And when she denied it, he hit her in the back of the head with a board. What was I to do? I couldn't do anything about defending her. I would have given myself away. Well, evidently, Rena believed that this should be the end of our partnership. One of my more lucrative jobs in the Klondike was as a gold weigher. I weighed over $1.5 million in gold dust at Sweetwater Bill's joint. And I never made a mistake that wasn't in favor of the house. To supplement my own income, I would replace the piece of carpet under my foot every Saturday. I would then burn the carpet, a smelting process that grossed me $2,000 a week. My favorite way of making money in the Klondike was the Badger game. This consisted little to no capital, just a friendly female acquaintance. She would show up at a saloon or bar, pretending to be a unfaithful wife out looking for a flag. She'd take them to a room, this unsuspecting Mark, and I would barge in that room like a wronged husband. Oh. One day my partner said that she had found a Mark and was taking him to her room, but I'd lingered too long at the saloon. In an operation like this, timing was everything. I didn't even stop at home to pick up my revolver. A bluff was my only chance. Well, I ran down there, and on my way I picked up a tomato can and ripped off the label. I then ran up to her room, barged on in, and found the two of them in the most compromising of positions. Then, simulating both rage and grief, I raised the tomato can and said it was filled with nitroglycerin and I was going to blow the three of us to smithereens. And then I topped it off. It's the only way to mend my broken heart. Well, then Mark babbled of about $10,000 in gold dust that he had that he would gladly pay to me as reparations for my broken heart. Well, I thought over his offer and I tossed the tomato can. And then I accepted. Once he had left, it was time to split the take. I looked to my female accomplice and I tossed her the tomato can. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she said. "I don't know, but I just made $10,000 with it." Oh, I tried it all on the Klondike. And I give myself credit for doing so well in a place where you had to work so hard. I hate work more than the Lord hates Philadelphia. I also never found any virtue in working during the day. I always felt that money worth striving for should be made at night, with blood and perspiration. Preferably not mine. I mean, why should I work? I've done no crime. I left the Klondike because of what happened to a friend of mine. He froze to death while lacing up his shoes. They had to bury him in a bass drum. And since there wasn't a bass drum big enough for me north of Seattle, well, I headed back to the States. Klondike was a place where I had learned from my scars. I set sail with a gambling partner that I had met and known. We had about $5,000 among the two of us. And we both agreed, first day on ship, not to waste our grub stakes by gambling. Well, the next day I stormed into his room and said, "Peel me off a couple grand, I've got a sucker." A bit of arguing took place. Eventually, though, he gave me the greenbacks. Then as I left his room, I looked back to him and said, "By the way, how do you play pinochle?" The rest of the instruction was provided by the sucker. And then we came to port at San Francisco with severely depleted resources. Everyone's a sucker outside their own racket. You show the first sign of intelligence by not trying things that you know nothing about. I always found luck to be utterly capricious, and percentages and common sense to be entirely reliable. If anyone is an expert at those things, all they have to do is exhibit sugar and swat the fly. Gambling, as in life, says that everyone is a sucker, but also be urbane to everyone. For you never know what pool the next sucker will bite. And I never call a man a fool, no. I borrow from him. Since I always had my bag packed and was ready to go anywhere at a moment's notice, I decided to take my chances in New York. My brother Addison had been doing well for himself there as an architect, and was rubbing shoulders with the Fortune 400 crowd. Well, I told Addison I, too, was ready to be a society gentleman. He was skeptical. He said I would have to prove I was no longer associating with ragamuffins. Well, I was ready to be a gentleman, but not a snob. And I believed Addison needed to pay for that little bit of effrontery. Well, the next day I showed up at his private box at the National Horse Show. He had no choice but to introduce me to his guests. "So where are you put up now that you're in town?" he asked. "My brother, I'm put up at the Cat House at 42nd Street and Broadway. I sit there all day, read my beloved books, and smoke opium. I prefer New York over the Klondike. Flesh beats scenery." Addison changed 4 colors after I said that. But his friends all thought I was joking, and they all had a good laugh. Well, seated in the box next to Addison was a handsomely dressed, lavishly bejeweled woman named Myra Yerkes. She was wearing a string of mothballs, an emerald around her neck that was big enough for a creme de la menthe for a cow. She was recently divorced to Charles Yerkes, the millionaire. Yerkes had built a Roman villa off 5th Avenue. It sported 9 baths, one of which was solid onyx. The master bed in the master bedroom belonged to King Leopold of Belgium. He was nuts, and so was Yerkes. After Addison introduced us, Myra asked me, "Where's your wife, Mr. Mizner?" "Why, I have no wife, madam." are you spoken for, Mr. Mizner? Why, I'm practically engaged to an armless midget on 42nd Street and Broadway. Why did you choose an armless midget? Adam, she was the only woman I could strike with impunity. Myra and I started seeing each other after that. Not long after, we were married. The weeks leading up to marriage are like the introductions to a tedious book. Myra always liked for me to sing to her, so every night I would croon for her some of the ballads that I'd learned in the Yukon. 'Tis strange how often things go wrong, a sigh too deep, a kiss too long, then comes the mist, the cold, the rain, and nothing is ever the same again. Oh me, oh my, oh me, oh my, 'tis strange how often things go right, in golden day or mellow night, for kisses wane and sighs remain, and memory tortures us again. I'd never considered marriage before, but I had an open mind. After a short time in the marriage game, though, I've decided that most open minds should be closed for repairs. Insanity is grounds for divorce, but by the same token, insanity is also the quickest mental detour to marriage. Well, I realized I could get whatever I wanted, as long as I always agreed with Myra. I would wake up at noon. I'd eat good food, I'd drink good wine, and I laughed heartily. To this day, I still don't know what's wrong with that routine. Well, around this time I decided it was time for me to take up a new job. I became a boxing manager for one Stanley Ketchel. Ah, yes. I turned one half of the Yerkes mansion into his private campground. Well, he was once the middleweight champion of the world. He went 12 rounds with the Jack Johnson before he got knocked out. One day before an exhibition bout, I couldn't find Ketchel. But not long after, I did find him. In a hotel bed, with a blonde and a brunette, smoking opium. He looked at me and said, "Well, what can I do, boss?" And I said, "I'll tell you what you could do. Move over." Around this time, Myra told me that I should go out and make as much money as Mr. Yerkes used to. I remember one night, the Peacock Alley at the Waldorf. We had one of those arguments that leads to death to bystanders and sensational headlines. She was all like, "Oh, you!" and gave me a hard lick with an envelope filled with $30,000 in $1,000 bills. I was the first on my knees. I had picked up $8,000 before I realized I'd been insulted. I hated that anyone believed that money had anything to do with my marriage to Myra. I mean, I was born $8 short, and I turned out just fine. I also hated that there was really no loose money to be had anywhere, and pretending you're rich is the quickest way to become poor. Besides, marrying a woman for money, it's simply kid stuff. There were a lot of other rackets more suitable to a man of my talent. Though, during our brief happiness, I learned a lot about people who only look at you with the white of the eyes, unless they're ready to hurt you. It was amazing the amount of anonymous letters Myra would receive, bags of them, talking about how deplorable of a human she had married. I remember my last day in the Yerkes mansion. She had received 10 letters before I'd even gotten out of bed. Well, the fight was on again, and in the middle of it, I tiptoed out. When asked on what grounds I got divorced, I said, oh, marriage is sufficient. Now, big wholesome worries are bound to happen in anyone's life, but I've learned the best way to avoid the wrinkles is to omit preliminary fretting. You see, hair can be dyed, moles eradicated, chins lifted, teeth realigned, but a sharp tongue seldom responds to treatment. And I never complained. After all, a telegraph pole only hits a joyrider in self-defense, and I was the one who agreed to be married. But I'll tell you, it's a darn unpleasant experience to be chased out of your own house by a couple of Pinkertons while carrying a lard can full of jewels. I had spent a good deal of my marriage smoking in bed, wondering if I was getting enough rest. Again, I never really saw a virtue in waking up early. I had known too many of those exasperating hand-rubbers who would wake up at 7:30 and go to their jobs and not accomplish anything worth a hoot. Why, the brightest minds I ever knew were in the theater. People who had no reference to time and were up at all hours of the day. I mean, the only kind of sleep I ever needed was, another 5 minutes, please? At this time, I decided to make contact with Paul Armstrong, a well-known playwright at the time. He was, he convinced me to collaborate with him on some plays. Him and the vagrancy laws. Besides, I wanted to see something of mine in print for once, other than my thumbs. Our whole collaboration was a murderous conflict. He would be up at dawn, and I would not yawn until I saw light. One morning he phoned me, asked if I was ready to concentrate on some work of ours. And I said, concentration be damned! Why don't you hang up this phone and let me get some rest? If what you do is a form of concentration, then why should I ruin a talent? If you take a hen and draw a line with its beak, it'll concentrate. It'll stare at it lifelessly like you do with a script. I'm cutting you off this wire and going back to writing in my own good time. Not just with nonchalance, but with poisonous indifference. Concentration is for day workers, and I'm about to put the covers over a genius! Not long after, Paul dragged me to Baltimore. Trapped me in a hotel room for 5 days. Well, during this time, we wrote our first play, The Deep Purple. He could only wake me up by making me the best coffee in the world. He made me so used to work that seeing him made my stomach ache with exhaustion. Well, not long after, the play premiered in New York, and I was famous. But you know, fame is just the prolonging of neighborhood gossip, right? The most lifeless faces I've ever seen were those first night audiences in the theater. People who had no opinion of their own, unless they were told it by somebody else. Particularly a drama critic. Oh, you know who those are, don't you? That's the person who tells the playwright what he meant when he wrote the play. Well, The Deep Purple bombed. Apparently it was because virtue was not triumphant. If in truth virtue was triumphant, there would be no Fifth Avenue or Wall Street. Another critic even went and said, it was an embarrassment to the amusement profession and deplorable and reprehensible to the last degree. If that person could be a critic, I could make a watch that produces milk. Anyone who could write home for money can write for a newspaper. Another producer who was always interested in getting something I was writing was Al Woods. He would always ask me if I had something, so much so that eventually I got embarrassed about it. Well, one day I just happened to be passing Al's office, and I needed money. I hadn't a single idea in the world, but I went in anyway. I had to get $1,000 from somewhere. I walked in and Al beamed at me. He was holding 2 telephone receivers and smiling and said, "I knew you'd be here, sooner or later." And I said, "Yes, Al, yes, and I'm going to write just the kind of show you'll produce, a crime story." "Oh, great. Well, what's it about?" And I went, "Well, Al, it's about a boat." Good. Crook's on a boat. The phone rang, and I went on. I explained scenic effects to him, while he had a minute or two half looking at me from the phones. And I just kind of went on and on until I had an ending that sounded snappy. And in the end, Al just looked at me, with a glazed look in his eyes. He had no idea what the plot was about. Neither did I. And he just said, "Sounds pretty good. When are you gonna have it?" I was like, "Well, Al, you'll get it just when I finish it, when I churn out the last line in about 3 weeks." "Perfect." Then I started to mosey over to the window and said, "Now, a little money, Al, please." Al then called to his secretary, "Cassandra!" And she sauntered in. "What?" He said, "Give Mr. Mizner here $500. "Oh, Al," I protested, "make it 1,000. "Make it 1,000. I then walked back over to the window, watched a woman walk a handsome greyhound down the street. And then the secretary said, "Charge it to what? What's the name of the show?" I looked at the lady walking the greyhound outside, turned back and said, "The Greyhound." "Greyhound? But I thought you said it was about a boat." I looked straight at Al and said, "Ocean Greyhound." And while Al waited for the script, I worked, and in time, but not on time, The Greyhound was born. I had written it as a serious drama and gave it a tryout in Pittsburgh. At the end of the first act, the calm, gray-haired steel magnate's wives were all in the aisles, laughing. We had a farce and we didn't know it. I laughed at it when we took it to New York, and so did the audience. I'll be honest, I got most of my dramatic material from some pretty doubtful quarters. I probably know more about crooks than any man who has a controlling interest in his own liberty. Most people go as far as a Broadway play to get a look at seaminess. But me, I'm willing to look for it in the back alleys. I'm just an errand boy for the theater. But the social police record of someone is of no interest to me. Most people in stress, whether they're cops or crooks, know about the crooked side of nature. I once heard a judge say to a man, "You are charged with petty larceny." And the man responded, "What other kind of larceny is open to a poor man?" Broadway is a place you'll never see the likes of again. I never went to Coney Island, but I never had to go. Coney Island came to Broadway. Gone were the fine restaurants and the theater houses, replaced with shabby shacks and cafeterias and the coffee houses. The little movies took over those theater homes, and Broadway became a place that was like a heel. It was very run down. But you know, Broadway wasn't always just fine restaurants and theaters. No. It was home to beautiful women. I embarrassingly was born in bed with a lady. Women are seldom like men. They're either extremely incredible or unspeakable. If a woman told you exactly what they were thinking, you would be astounded. But since most women would rather attract or amuse than astound, they hoard pearls of wisdom. I've known women from the best houses and the best homes. But the only time a wife ever gives undivided attention to her husband is when he's mumbling in his sleep. I had gotten to know a large assortment of women at this time due to my job at the Hotel Runs. I became the night manager there. We had a large clientele. Whores, pimps, camped women and their patrons, card sharks that worked the Atlantic liners, and of course people that suffered from 8th Avenue malaria. Oh, you know. These patrons, they'd come in, they would eat, drink, laugh, dance the night away, but would sicken at the very mention of work! Most of our clienteles were kept-ees anyway. And with a clientele like this, it's important to have a couple of house rules. For example, no opium smoking in the elevator. Guests will carry out their own dead. Guests who decide to jump from their windows will try to aim for the net encircling the 4th floor. No piano playing before 5 p.m., as it may disturb the other guests. And when the gong sounds at 3 a.m., everyone will return to their own rooms. Our motto was, get off any floor and walk in any door. After 6 months, I decided to leave the hotel business. It had been fun, but I felt it was too strenuous for a person of my retiring disposition. At this time, I had an event that caused me to be hospitalized. From what the doctors claimed to have been a nervous breakdown. It was the only time in my life that I couldn't joke or make a sly comment about it. You see, my mother had died. I'd gone a long way. I'd walked a long mile. Never had I met a more loving or perfect person in my life, ever. When I got out of the hospital, Irving Berlin dedicated a song to me that said, "The black sheep comes back in the fold." It implied I was hanging around, bleeding with remorse. I was the most unfolded man I had ever known. On my way home that night, I was attacked and beaten, left for dead in an alley. And the police asked me, at the hospital, what had hit me. All I could say was, St. Patrick's Cathedral. Well, it was at this time I decided I needed a change. I took up deep sea fishing with a school of sharks who always warned people against playing cards with strangers. I learned I can always get the trust of strangers by warning them against strangers. But I can only call these losers in these games of chance, or victim, as he liked to be called. These money grubbers, they all believed themselves to be pillars of society. A man of faith, of promise. And I knew this to not always be the case. As I said, I could only call these people money grubbers, these people who had pushed themselves out of society for having no qualifications for it. Yowling losers who would literally have the best company they have ever had in their dull, boring lives. Ignorant, stupid, inconsiderate bores who could risk thousands out of their millions. Their irreverent jokes laughed at, their backs slapped in comradeship. They'd eat the best food, drink the best wine. And they would literally have the times of their lives. For this, for all of this, paid a small price of an embarrassment of their riches. Well, eventually a Mr. Pinkerton came on board and caught wind of our games, and I hauled in my reel. I went ashore. The Florida land boom of 1924 made temporary multimillionaires out of both me and my brother Addison. Oh, the architect. He had created one of the gaudiest subdivisions ever. Boca Raton, or Buku Rotten as his competitors like to call it. To advertise for Boca Raton, we said it was the ancient headquarters of Captain Teach or Blackbeard. I'll tell you, Florida was a platinum sucker trap at this point. I was embarrassed. I was used to dealing with one sucker at a time. I wasn't ready for thousands of them. And so what we did was we buried some doubloons, put some relics of Blackbeard in Boca Raton Inlet, and they were dug up under wild excitement. Oh. Well, the boom ended as quickly as it started. The big speculators, the small speculators, they all started accusing the other of fraud. Lawsuits came by the thousands. One day the chief of police knocked on my door, came in, and I opened up a drawer and pulled out a stack of subpoenas and complaints and said to him, "Sir, would you like this at the top or the middle of the deck?" Most of the time I would just open the door, put my arms out, admit to being Wilson Mizner, and accept service. I then decided there was only one place for an elderly desperado like me to go: Hollywood. I checked into the Ambassador Hotel with nothing for me to fall back on but my battered backside. I knew nothing about the town. To me, Fairbanks and Pickford were just another mule team. And then I learned that the true heroes were in the audience. Well, the place almost made a good movie once, but they caught it just in time. Hollywood was like a play with a bad cast. Well, at this time I got a job working for Warner Brothers, writing screenplays. Working for them was like having sex with a porcupine. It was 100 pricks against 1. I was given my own cubicle to worry and fret in, and most of the time I would just sit there and wonder what I was thinking. I started to write a little thing called Yukon Days, something that no one was ever destined to see. It was one of the gangster screenplays. I just had to make this Yukon flow on the silver screen. I was given $2,000 before the first story conference. But when the conference came along, a film very similar to Ugande's premiered, and I was told to go back to my cubicle and come up with something else. Well, I went back and I said, Wilson, don't you worry. And since nobody else was there to respond but me, I said, no, I won't. And I didn't. After trying to get a movie into those moguls' heads, I decided that it would be easier to get some gravy into their fat bellies instead. That brought me to purchasing the Brown Derby with my partner Jack Warner. There were so many things wrong with Hollywood that if someone was to make a movie about it, it would take an hour just to screen the titles. Hollywood is versed in adjective and hyperbole. If you ask a butcher, how's business? He would say, fantastic, but I hope things pick up soon. Well, after getting the Derby, it was the first time nobody counted the silverware when I came to dinner. And I turned traitor to vagrancy at 50. One night here at the Derby, an old burglar friend of mine came by and asked for a loan. I said to him, what? Doesn't it get dark anymore? I don't mind getting a touch here and there, but I prefer that my applicants pep up their stories before I peel off a couple of bills. Whenever I felt like praying, I've given some needy bum a 5-spot. It helps them believe in God, and I believe if there is a God, I would get it back. Though it was never any problem to me, as I probably swatched the 5 from some unsuspecting sucker in the first place. If I hadn't, I promise you the needy bum would never have gotten his hands on it. Now when I say bum, I'm not being belittling. I once knew a king, and he was just a bum with superb luck. One thing is certain, though, in this slightly dazed universe of ours. The man who will accomplish anything will be a man of confidence, and must not think of his chances of failure. To do so is like to mention the devil or mention doubt in life's forward plunge. As a matter of indisputable, undeniable fact, everything in life constitutes a risk, and the learned and lucky are the ones who learn to take it gracefully and helpfully. Looking backwards is a pretty dangerous luxury in this world. We must always be trying to strive forward. We are all born with these traits like loyalty and optimism and faith, and we must not give up on them on the simple pretense of being smart. The con games I invented cost way more than any legal effort, and they never led to anything like permanent cash. Granted, the reason I never followed my own advice is that I always considered myself like the rabbit who could stop a Mack truck. I respect faith, but I believe it is doubt that gets you an education. The most pious people I'd ever met were dominated by fear, and fear dominates most people. I remember I was 16 when I left home. I wired my mother a month later to send me $500. She responded back the next day, "I'm sorry, I did not receive your telegram." I was a little disappointed, but I knew the son of a woman that smart would never starve. Life's a tough proposition. The first 100 years are the hardest. And if they bury me early in the morning, don't be a sucker and get up. Just remember me as the uncrowned king of the manly art of nocturnal debate.
Picture heaven firmament without a star. Picture Fritzy Chrysler without a fiddle. Picture poor Philadelphia without a biddle.